Welcome back to the deep dive. We have a really heavy one today.
Yeah, heavy is probably putting it lightly.
We are looking at a stack of notes here that covers a figure who has essentially rewritten the script for modern media, business, and definitely politics. We are talking, of course, about Donald J. Trump.
Right.
And I want to be super clear right off the top because this is a name that instantly raises blood pressure, one way or the other. What exactly are we looking at today?
Well, we are looking at the machinery of the man. We aren't doing the cable news thing where we scream about the tweet of the day. We are doing a biographical analysis based entirely on the audiobook, Donald Trump, the billionaire who became America's 45th president by Mr. Books English.
So this is really the long view.
The 20-chapter view, yeah. The author frames this whole thing as a saga of ambition. The mission here for us today is to trace that arc for you. We want to understand how a kid from Queens, using a very specific set of tools learned in New York real estate, managed to essentially dismantle the American political establishment.
That's the disruptor angle the book talks about.
Exactly. The central tension in this text is about transferability. Can you take the skills that make you a shark in Manhattan real estate? Things like audacity, branding, debt leverage, and just paste them onto the Oval Office.
It's kind of a square peg, round hole question.
Or a wrecking ball versus a statue question, depending on how you look at it. And a quick note off tone before we dive in, because this is important for you listening. This source material attempts to be a chronicle, not a manifesto.
Right. Our job today is just to be impartial analysts of this specific text.
Exactly. We are going to unpack the narrative, the facts, and the arguments from both his diehard supporters and his fiercest critics, just exactly as the author presents them.
Fair enough. No pom-poms, no pitchforks.
Yeah.
Just the story. So where does the story actually begin? Because with Trump, it feels like he's just, always been there on our TVs.
Yeah, it does feel that way. But to understand the man, you really have to understand the shadow he grew up in. We have to go back to 1946, Queens, New York, and we really have to talk about Fred.
Fred Trump, the father.
The patriarch. You honestly cannot overstate Fred Trump's influence. The book paints him as this formidable, almost monolithic figure. He was the son of German immigrants, and he built a massive real estate empire in the outer boroughs, mostly Brooklyn and Queens. But he wasn't building skyscrapers.
Right. What was the actual business model? Because it wasn't luxury.
No, not at all. It was high volume, middle-class housing, brick and mortar, government contracts. Fred was absolutely obsessed with cost. The source describes a relentless work ethic. This is a guy who would literally walk through a construction site and pick up dropped nails because he hated waste.
Pick up nails. And so he was incredibly disciplined.
Disciplined and incredibly risk-averse. That's the key takeaway here. Fred's mantra was think big, which Donald obviously adopted, but Fred built safe. He wanted guaranteed returns. He didn't care about being famous or in the papers. He cared about being rich and solvent.
Okay, so you have this stern, penny-pinching builder father. Where does the Trump come from? The gold, the hair, the showmanship?
That's the mother, Mary Trump.
She often gets left out of the story, doesn't she?
She really does. But the author argues she's the missing link in the personality profile. Mary was a Scottish immigrant, and she just loved the spectacle of things. The book mentions she was mesmerized by the coronation of Queen Elizabeth.
Wow, so a real appreciation for pageantry.
Exactly. She had this sense of the dramatic, a flair for the theatrical that Fred completely lacked.
So Donald is really the synthesis of the two of them.
Right. Fred provided the engine, the drive, the ruthlessness, and Mary provided the paint job. She gave him the permission to be a showman. But growing up in that house wasn't just about absorbing traits from mom and dad. It was a highly competitive arena. And this brings us to a really tragic element of the biography, which is the older brother, Fred Jr.
Yeah, I've heard about him. He was supposed to be the heir, right? The namesake.
He was the firstborn son. And in a dynastic family like that, that means everything. The weight of the empire was squarely on his shoulders. But Fred Jr., he just wasn't that guy. He didn't have the killer instinct.
What did he want to do?
He wanted to be a pilot. He was described as softer, much more easygoing than his father, Donald.
And I imagine Fred Sr. didn't like that one bit.
He despised it. He viewed it as pure weakness. The pressure on Fred Jr. was immense, and he eventually crumbled under it. The book details his decline into severe alcoholism and his eventual death at a pretty young age.
That has to be horrifying to watch as a younger brother.
It was a deeply formative trauma for Donald. The analysis here is fascinating. Donald watched his brother be destroyed, not just by the alcohol, but by the failure to be what the father demanded.
So what did he take away from that? What was the lesson?
Two things, really. One, a physiological aversion to substance abuse. Donald Trump is a teetotaler. He doesn't drink, doesn't smoke. He cites Fred Jr. as the exact reason. But the deeper psychological lesson was completely binary. In this world, you are either a killer or you are the one getting crushed.
Survival of the fittest.
Survival of the toughest, yeah.
Yeah.
He decided he would never be Fred Jr. He would be the killer his father wanted him to be.
But he was a bit of a wild card as a kid, wasn't he? I remember reading about him getting into trouble a lot.
Restless energy is the polite term the book uses. He was mischievous, arguably aggressive. So, at age 13, the parents make a huge decision. They ship him off to the New York Military Academy.
Which sounds like a classic punishment, shape up or ship out.
It definitely started that way.
Right.
But the book argues this was actually the crucible that made him. It wasn't just about polishing boots and marching. It was a hierarchical world where dominance was actively rewarded.
So he figured out how to work the system.
He learned how to navigate a rigid chain of command, how to bully when necessary, and how to charm his superiors.
And he thrived there.
He loved it. He became a high-ranking cadet. The source says this is where he really honed that never say die attitude. It channeled that restless aggression into focused ambition. He realized that if he played the role of the strongman, he could win.
So he comes out of the academy, goes to Wharton for the business degree, which we know he loves to mention.
Oh, constantly.
Right. And he graduates in 1968. He goes back to work for Fred. But this is where the friction really starts, isn't it? Because Donald isn't content with building rent-controlled apartment blocks in Queens.
No, not at all. And this is part 2 of our breakdown, the move to Manhattan. You have to understand the geography of New York at that time to understand the psychology here. To a guy like Fred Trump, Manhattan was a cesspool.
Because in the 70s, New York City was dying.
Exactly. High crime, graffiti everywhere. The city was literally looming on bankruptcy. Fred said, stay in Brooklyn. The money is safe here.
And Donald looked across the river and saw what? Exactly. Opportunity.
He saw a giant discount bin. He saw completely undervalued assets. And above all, he saw glory. You don't get famous in Brooklyn. You get famous on Fifth Avenue. But to get there, he needed a deal to prove he belonged. He needed a proof of concept.
Enter the Commodore Hotel.
The Commodore. This is the origin story of the dealmaker. The Commodore was an absolute wreck next to Grand Central Station. It was hemorrhaging money, physically falling apart. Nobody wanted to touch it. Donald Trump, who is still in his 20s at this point, decides he's going to buy it and transform it into a luxury Grand Hyatt.
But he didn't have the money for that, did he?
He didn't have the money and he didn't have the reputation. This is exactly where he invents his signature move, the public-private partnership.
Okay, that sounds like boring bureaucratic speak. What does it actually mean for you and me in this context?
It basically means getting the government to pay for your risk. He went to the city government, which remember was desperate for literally any development, and he negotiated a massive tax abatement.
Tax cut?
A huge one. He essentially walked in and said, I will fix this massive eyesore, which will help the city look better, but you have to forgive my property taxes for 40 years. It was completely unprecedented. He saved millions and millions of dollars over the lifetime of that deal.
That is wild. So he used the tax break to get the loans.
Yes. He used the promise of the tax break to secure the loans from the banks, used the loans to build the hotel, and used the hotel to launch his personal brand.
That's incredibly clever. He leveraged the city's own desperation against them.
It was brilliant negotiation. The book highlights this as the exact moment he realized that politics and business weren't separate worlds at all. They were levers you could pull against each other to get what you want.
So the Commodore becomes the Grand Hyatt, and it's a massive hit. He's on the map. But he's not Trump yet with the capital T. He's just a successful young developer.
Right. He needs a monument. He needs a flagship. And that brings us to 1983, Trump Tower.
Right, on Fifth Avenue.
This building is absolutely crucial to the book's analysis. The source calls it an imposition of his persona onto the skyline. Just think about the aesthetic of that building.
It's loud, very loud.
It's mirrored glass, it's brass, it's gold everywhere. In a neighborhood full of old stone and understated quiet wealth, Trump Tower screamed, "Look at me." It was the 1980s personified in a building.
And it worked.
It worked incredibly well. It attracted the celebrities, the wealthy foreigners, the new money. It cemented the equation in the public's mind that Trump equals luxury.
But there's a really important mechanical difference here between him and his father again. Fred built with cash, or very conservative loans. How was Donald funding this massive expansion?
Debt. Just massive, unprecedented amounts of debt. Donald viewed debt not as a liability to be afraid of, but as a primary tool for growth. He firmly believed in OPM, other people's money.
There's that old saying, right? If you owe the bank a little, it's your problem.
If the bank lends you $100 million, you have a problem. If the bank lends you $1 billion, the bank has a problem.
So he deliberately made himself too big to fail.
Exactly. But that strategy definitely has a limit. And the book takes us into the dark side of this massive risk tolerance when we talk about Atlantic City.
The casinos.
He went completely all in. The Taj Mahal Trump Castle, Trump Plaza. He over-leveraged himself to an extreme degree. And when the economy dipped and the casino market saturated, the whole house of cards collapsed. There were multiple bankruptcies.
Now, usually for a normal businessman, a bankruptcy is the end of the biography. It's the tragic final chapter. But for Trump, it was just a plot twist.
And this is the insight that I think is most important for understanding his presidency later on. The source explains that Trump used bankruptcy laws strategically. He didn't go personally bankrupt. His corporations did.
Oh, so he completely insulated himself.
He used Chapter 11 bankruptcy to legally force the banks to restructure his debt. He basically told them, if you liquidate me right now, you get pennies on the dollar. If you keep me alive and let me keep my name on the building, maybe you get your money back eventually.
So he essentially held his own brand hostage.
In a way, yes, he did. He managed to separate the man from the entity. The casinos failed, the bondholders lost millions, everyday contractors got stiffed. But Donald Trump, he was still living in the golden penthouse in Manhattan.
Still appearing on magazine covers.
Exactly. He realized that as long as the image of success remained intact in the public eye, the actual reality of the balance sheet didn't really matter.
Which is a perfect segue to part 3 of our deep dive. Because at this point, the real estate itself is almost secondary. The main product becomes the name itself.
The shift from builder to brand. This happens in the late 80s and really accelerates through the 90s. He realizes that building physical skyscrapers is hard. It's risky. Licensing is incredibly easy money.
Right, you put the name on the steak, you put the name on the bottled water.
Put the name on a massive building in Turkey or Canada that you don't even own. He just gets a licensing fee, and someone else takes all the actual construction and financial risk. But to make that name valuable enough to license, he had to constantly maintain the myth.
And the absolute foundation of that myth was the book, The Art of the Deal.
1987, the massive bestseller. The source argues this book is what permanently solidified the genius entrepreneur character in the American psyche. It didn't matter if the Atlantic City casinos were struggling in reality. The book said he was a winner who never lost.
It framed his chaotic style as, what was the phrase? Truthful hyperbole.
Truthful hyperbole. It's fascinating.
It's an oxymoron.
It is, but it's a brilliant marketing tactic. It's the idea that playing to people's wildest fantasies is a perfectly valid and effective form of promotion. It doesn't have to be strictly factually true. It just has to feel big and exciting.
But books are one thing. You know, TV is a whole different animal. And if we are tracing the path to the White House, we have to talk about the NBC show.
The Apprentice. You really cannot write the history of the 21st century without The Apprentice. It launched in 2004, and the source argues it completely, single-handedly rehabilitated his public image.
Because in the 90s, he was kind of a tabloid punchline, wasn't he? The messy divorces, the constant gossip columns.
He was definitely a celebrity, but he wasn't necessarily respected as a serious business authority by the mainstream. The Apprentice changed all of that. Mark Burnett built a dark, imposing boardroom set, put Trump in this massive high-backed chair, and they edited hours and hours of chaotic footage to make him look like the ultimate decisive leader.
The ultimate arbiter of fate.
With the catchphrase, "You're fired."
Right. It projected absolute control.
The analysis in the book is really sharp on this point. It says the show recalibrated his public persona entirely. It fundamentally blurred the line between entertainment and actual leadership.
Because millions of Americans were inviting him into their living rooms every single week.
Exactly. And they saw him making these supposedly tough decisions, rewarding competence, punishing, and firing incompetence. It made the very idea of a President Trump seem plausible, simply because he had already looked and acted like a president in that boardroom chair for over a decade.
He had basically been playing the president of the Trump organization on television.
And he had name recognition that traditional politicians would spend hundreds of millions of dollars to buy. He got it for free, and he actually got paid to build it.
And that brings us to the massive disruption of 2016. Because while the media treated his run like a sudden whim, the book argues it was actually a very slow burn.
He didn't just wake up one morning in 2015 and decide to run for president out of the blue. Chapter 6 and 7 go into deep detail on this. He was testing the political waters for decades.
You mean going back to the 80s?
Going back to the 1980s, he was going on Oprah. He was taking out full-page ads in the New York Times, complaining about trade deficits with Japan and later China. The core themes of his 2016 run, that America was being ripped off by other countries and had weak leadership, were already there 30 years ago.
So the message itself was remarkably consistent, even if his actual political party affiliation bounced around a bit over the years.
Correct. But then you have the birther controversy during the Obama years. The source frames this as his real entry point into the modern right-wing media ecosystem.
Right, by aggressively questioning Obama's citizenship.
Yes. By doing that, he positioned himself as the ultimate anti-establishment figure. He realized very quickly that extreme controversy generated wall-to-wall coverage.
And for him, coverage is currency.
Always. Which perfectly sets up the moment on the golden escalator. June 2015. The infamous announcement speech, "Make America Great Again."
I remember the political pundits just laughing. They all thought it was a PR stunt to negotiate a better contract with NBC for The Apprentice.
They completely misread the room. The source identifies his primary campaign strategy as calculated chaos. While seasoned politicians like Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio were writing careful policy papers and trying to look presidential, Trump was basically throwing rhetorical grenades on Twitter every morning.
Why did that work so well? Why did the chaos benefit him?
Because he completely bypassed the traditional media filter. He didn't need the New York Times or CNN to interpret his message for the voters. He spoke directly to what he called the forgotten man.
And who exactly is the forgotten man in the context of this book?
The white working class, particularly in the Rust Belt. States like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. The book spends a lot of time analyzing this specific voter coalition.
These are the folks who saw their local factories close down over the last 20 years.
Yes, they felt economically left behind by globalization, and they felt culturally looked down upon by the elites in the coastal cities.
But it's a massive paradox, isn't it? The guy with the gold-plated private jet speaking for the guy working on the assembly line.
It is a paradox, but the source argues he essentially sold himself as a class traitor. He basically stood on stage and said, "I know this system is entirely rigged because I'm the guy who used it. I bought the politicians. I know all their tricks, and now I'm going to fix it for you." It was a profoundly powerful narrative.
And it resonated, which leads to election night, the shock heard around the world.
Chapter 8 creates a really vivid picture of that night. The polls were almost universally wrong. The so-called blue wall of reliable Democratic states just crumbled.
The book also points to some unforced errors by his opponent, right?
Definitely. The source suggests Hillary Clinton's comment calling his supporters a basket of deplorables was a fatal error. It deeply energized Trump's base, giving them a badge of honor. He ultimately lost the popular vote by nearly 3 million, but he won the Electoral College in an absolute landslide.
And that set the stage for a very specific, unprecedented type of presidency. He won on a technicality of the constitutional system, not a broad, overwhelming popularity mandate.
Right. So he entered the White House basically as a combatant from day one. And this takes us to part 5 of our dive, the CEO in the Oval Office.
This is where the rubber meets the road. The ongoing theory for years was, we need a successful businessman to run the country like a business. So what actually happens when a private CEO takes over the massive executive branch?
Friction. Unbelievable amounts of friction. The source argues that the skill set of a CEO, especially a private family company CEO like Trump, who answers to no board of directors, is fundamentally at odds with the role of a president.
Because in a private company, you give an order and it just happens.
Exactly. You say build it, they build it. If they don't, you fire them on the spot.
But in government, you have Congress, you have the courts, you have the press.
And you have the massive career bureaucracy. Trump referred to this as the deep state. He was incredibly frustrated from the start that he couldn't just snap his fingers and dictate laws or policy changes. The book highlights the staggering turnover rate in his administration because of this frustration.
Right. We had a revolving door of chiefs of staff, communications directors, secretaries of state.
Big names like Anthony Scaramucci, Steve Bannon, Rex Tillerson. They didn't last because Trump viewed political alliances as entirely transactional. If you weren't useful to him that specific day, or if you stole his spotlight, you were gone.
And often you found out you were fired by reading a tweet.
Exactly. But despite all the organizational chaos, the book does list very significant, tangible policy achievements. It wasn't just 4 years of noise. Actual things changed in the country.
Absolutely. Chapters 10 through 12 detail the legislative wins. What was the biggest one?
The biggest legislative victory was undoubtedly the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. He completely slashed the corporate tax rate, dropping it from 35% down to 21%.
Which is just a massive boon for Wall Street and large corporations.
It was huge. And he coupled that tax cut with a massive wave of executive deregulation. He formally pulled the United States out of the Paris Climate Agreement. He rolled back dozens of environmental protections and financial regulations.
The argument being that this would unleash the economy.
Right, unleash the animal spirits of the free market. And to his credit, for the first 3 years, the economy was visibly strong, unemployment was very low, the stock market was hitting record highs.
But the legacy that will probably outlive us all, and certainly outlive his term, is the judiciary.
Without a single doubt. He appointed 3 Supreme Court justices in one term: Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett. Plus, he filled the lower federal courts with dozens of young, conservative judges.
Which is interesting because the book notes he wasn't really a policy wonk.
No, he didn't care about the granular legal details. The source points out that he essentially outsourced the judicial selection process to the Federalist Society, a conservative legal group. They gave him the lists, and he delivered the appointments. By doing that, he reshaped the American judicial system for a generation.
We have to talk about the border. We have to talk about the wall. It was the rallying cry at literally every event: build the wall.
The big, beautiful wall, as he called it. The reality of the wall, as the source points out, was vastly more complex than the rally chant. He did repair existing barriers, and his administration built some new stretches of fencing. But he certainly didn't get the continuous, solid concrete wall from sea to shining sea that he promised his voters.
And Mexico certainly didn't write a check for it.
No, they didn't. But the effort to enforce the border led to some of the most deeply controversial and painful moments of his entire term.
You mean the zero tolerance policy?
Yes. Systematically separating migrant children from their parents at the southern border. The book describes this as a massive collision between his hardline deterrence strategy and basic humanitarian values, which caused a huge bipartisan public outcry.
Moving to foreign policy, his doctrine was America first. But what did that actually look like in practice on the world stage?
It looked like a total rejection of the post-World War II international order. For decades, the U.S. strategy was built on multilateralism, building up NATO, the UN, broad global alliances. Trump was strictly bilateral and deeply transactional.
So he looked at an alliance like NATO and said what?
He said, "You guys aren't paying your bills. Why are American taxpayers protecting you if you won't hit your defense spending targets?"
He kind of treated it like a protection racket.
He treated it exactly like a real estate deal. If the terms weren't favorable to him in that moment, he threatened to walk away from the table. This completely terrified traditional European allies, but it absolutely delighted his political base, who felt America was constantly being taken advantage of by the world.
And then there were the trade wars.
Right. Heavy tariffs on China, tariffs on imported steel and aluminum. He was aggressively trying to force manufacturing back to the U.S.
Did it work?
The economic results were highly mixed. Some domestic industries got a boost, but others were severely hurt by the retaliatory tariffs from other countries. But politically, it worked perfectly because it showed his voters he was willing to throw a punch for American industry.
And we can't talk foreign policy without mentioning the North Korea summits. That was just surreal to watch.
Spectacle versus substance. The source dedicates an entire section to this dynamic. Trump flying out to meet Kim Jong-un, becoming the first sitting president to walk across the DMZ into North Korea.
It was incredible television.
It was the ultimate reality TV moment. It broke every single rule of traditional diplomatic protocol. But, as the book asks, did North Korea actually give up their nuclear weapons?
No. So it was a photo op.
The source argues it heavily legitimized a brutal dictator on the world stage without securing any concrete disarmament in return. But again, Trump dominated the global news cycle for weeks.
So we have 3 full years of this intense disruption, a booming economy, and constant media chaos. But then the universe throws a massive curveball. Part 6 of our deep dive. Crisis. and the end of the term.
Right, the year 2020. But just before we hit 2020, we have to briefly mention the constant investigations that plagued his administration. The Mueller report on Russian electoral interference literally hung over the entire first half of his term.
But they found no direct collusion, right? That was the big takeaway.
Yes, the report explicitly stated there was no criminal conspiracy established between the Trump campaign and the Russian government. However, it detailed multiple, very specific instances of potential obstruction of justice by the president.
So it was a legal gray area.
Exactly. But Trump brilliantly spun it to his base as total and complete exoneration.
And then almost immediately, the first impeachment happens.
The Ukraine phone call. He asked Ukrainian President Zelensky to launch an investigation into Joe Biden, his political rival. The House of Representatives impeached him for abuse of power, and the Senate, predictably along party lines, acquitted him.
It just further reinforced the intense partisan divide in the country.
It did. But honestly, none of the political scandals compared to the arrival of COVID-19.
The pandemic. Chapter 16 really frames this as the ultimate test of the Trump brand. Because you can gaslight a political opponent, you can spin a news story, but you cannot gaslight a biological virus.
You really can't.
Yeah.
And his response to the pandemic was, well, it was deeply contradictory.
Schizophrenic might be a better word.
That's a fair assessment based on the text. On one hand, you had Operation Warp Speed, and the source explicitly gives Trump a lot of credit here. He aggressively pushed the federal bureaucracy and pharmaceutical companies to develop a viable vaccine in record time.
That was a real triumph of his business-minded, cut-the-red-tape attitude.
It was. It saved countless lives.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, the daily public messaging was a disaster.
Right, the daily press briefings.
He constantly downplayed the severity of the virus, repeatedly said it would just miraculously disappear. He heavily politicized the wearing of masks, and he promoted unproven medical treatments like hydroxychloroquine from the podium.
Why did he do that, though? Why downplay a very visible threat?
The source argues that his core instinct was always to protect his greatest political asset, which was the booming stock market. He believed that admitting the severity of the health threat would spook the markets, so he minimized it, which ended up deeply confusing the public health response.
And despite his efforts, the economy cratered anyway.
The mandatory lockdowns completely wiped out all the economic gains of his first 3 years. We went from a historically booming economy to massive depression-level unemployment in a matter of weeks.
And right in the middle of this boiling cauldron of mass sickness and sudden economic collapse, we had the 2020 presidential election.
It was an absolute powder keg. Trump spent months leading up to November telling his supporters that the expanded mail-in voting was entirely fraudulent. He was very clearly, deliberately priming the pump for a contested election result long before a single vote was cast.
And when he ultimately lost to Joe Biden?
He simply refused to concede. We entered this deeply strange, tense interregnum period where the sitting president of the United States was loudly claiming from the White House that the election was a stolen fraud.
Which culminates in the events of January 6th.
The Save America rally in Washington, subsequent march in the Capitol building. The source solemnly describes this as the definitive watershed moment for modern American democracy.
Watching the U.S. Capitol being physically stormed by supporters waving massive Trump flags?
It was shocking. And it led directly to his second historic impeachment, this time for incitement of insurrection.
But he was acquitted by the Senate again.
Yes, he survived it politically. But the book heavily notes the historical weight of that day. It was a transfer of presidential power that fundamentally wasn't peaceful. It broke an unbroken streak of peaceful democratic transitions dating all the way back to the Civil War.
Which is heavy. So, taking all of this in, we arrive at part 7. Assessing the legacy. When the political dust finally settles, what are we actually left with?
The author uses a really helpful metaphor here. He calls it the split-screen legacy.
Two completely different realities, depending on who you ask.
Precisely. If you are a supporter, you look at the Trump presidency and you see a conquering hero. You see a man who actually kept his promises to his base. He appointed the conservative judges, he slashed the taxes, he forcefully stood up to China, and he prioritized national sovereignty.
You see a guy who was the only one brave enough to fight the corrupt deep state.
Right. But if you look at the other side of the screen, if you are a critic,
you see an absolute disaster.
You see a dangerous demagogue who systematically weakened democratic institutions, purposely inflamed racial and social tensions, horrifically botched a deadly pandemic response, and actively tried to overturn a legitimate, free election. You see an existential threat to democracy itself.
And what about the historian's view? The person trying to analyze this 50 or 100 years from now, removed from the emotion of it all.
The historian sees a massive global pivot point. The source argues that Trump wasn't just a bizarre American anomaly. He was the loudest manifestation of a much broader global populist wave. But more importantly for American politics, he permanently changed the job description.
How so? What's the permanent change?
He completely changed how a president communicates. The President of the United States is now essentially a full-time content creator. It's Twitter, social media, dominating the 24-hour news cycle through sheer force of personality. There's no going back to the quiet dignity of the fireside chat.
He proved that the norms were just suggestions.
Exactly. He proved that the unwritten rules of presidential behavior are incredibly fragile. They only actually exist if the person in power chooses to follow them. And he chose not to.
And there's a fundamental business lesson in there too, right at the end of the book.
The business politics experiment. The book concludes with this really profound thought. Running a democratic country is fundamentally not like running a private company. Efficiency and absolute control are the goals of a business, but consensus, debate, and compromise are the goals of a healthy democracy.
They're completely at odds with each other.
They are. The instincts that make you a billionaire in real estate can easily cause a constitutional crisis when applied to government.
It really brings us full circle back to the start. The saga of ambition.
From the quiet outer boroughs of Queens to the absolute center of the world. It is undeniably one of the most remarkable disruptive stories in all of American history, completely, regardless of how you personally feel about the protagonist.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought. A provocation based on everything we just unpacked from Mr. Book's English's text. We asked at the beginning about the transferability of skills from reality TV and real estate to the presidency.
Right.
Looking at the entirety of the Trump presidency, has the actual job description for the American president permanently changed for good? In this modern age of relentless social media and personal branding, do you, the electorate, even care about a traditional political resume anymore? Or do we now simply demand a brand?
Do we want a manager-in-chief, or do we want a star-in-chief? That is the defining question the 21st century is asking us.
And on that note, we are going to let you mull it over. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into the source material on Donald Trump. We will catch you on the next one.
Take care, everyone.